Your brain is a pretty amazing thing. It only weighs about 3 pounds, but everything you think, feel, and do happens because of it. What if there were a way to learn about how it works while building your own brain circuits, almost like Legos for the nervous system? These are NeuroBytes, electronic neuron simulators that allow you to do just that. There are different simulators for sensory input and motor output neurons, as well as those that simulate the neurons found in the brain and spinal cord, called interneurons. We'll focus on those first. Like real neurons in your brain, the interneuron simulators contain some pretty special parts. Just like trees have lots of leaves on them to receive sunlight inputs, neurons can have lots of dendrites on them to receive information inputs from other neurons, sometimes thousands of dendrites per cell. To keep it simple, your interneuron has 4. Neurons have a cell body area that contains things common to other cells, like a nucleus with DNA in it, ribosomes for protein production, and mitochondria for energy production. Neuron cell bodies are unique in that they also collect electrical signals from the dendrites and pass them on to a part of the cell called the axon hillock. It is here that the neuron computes whether or not those signals are strong enough and will be allowed to continue on. If they are, the axon boosts the signal using something called action potentials, which we'll talk about more later, and conducts them down to the end of the cell called the axon terminal. The axon terminal then plays a neat little magician's trick to pass those signals on to the next neuron. Since neurons aren't usually physically connected, electricity cannot normally flow directly between neurons. The axon terminal takes the incoming electrical signal and turns it into a chemical signal. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and they are released into the really tiny space between neurons called the synaptic cleft. The space is so small that you could fit over 1/2 million real synapses from your brain, end to end, inside this cartoon of a synaptic cleft. You won't use chemicals with your neuron simulators, but you can model communication between presynaptic, before the synaptic cleft, and postsynaptic, after the synaptic cleft, neurons using neurotransmitter cables. Red cables simulate excitatory transmitters, which increases the chances that the postsynaptic cell will fire an action potential and pass the signal on, while blue cables simulate inhibitory transmitters, which decreases the chances that the postsynaptic cell will fire an action potential and pass the signal on. We use the terms pre- and postsynaptic neurons because there is directionality in the nervous system. One of the important rules that our nervous system and NeuroBytes follows is that information typically only flows one way within cells, from dendrite inputs to axon terminal outputs, as well as between cells, axon terminal outputs to dendrite inputs. So, when you connect your NeuroBytes together, they cannot be connected axon terminal to axon terminal or dendrite to dendrite. Real neurons can't usually talk to each other that way, and neither can your NeuroBytes. NeuroBytes are electronic neuron simulators, so they must have a power source. The battery pack, which may look a bit different than this one, and power cable get connected to the large 7-pin connector found on any of the NeuroBytes neuron simulators. As you connect more NeuroBytes together into circuits, they will share power through the neurotransmitter cables, so only one power source is needed. One important note before you power up your neurons for the first time. The connectors on the power and neurotransmitter cables click in easily and are held in place by a tab, shown here. To remove the cables, you must pinch the tab with your finger and thumb before pulling the cable out. If it does not come out easily, try pinching again before pulling the cable out to avoid damaging it. Now, if you haven't already, take out your battery pack and black power cable and connect it to one of your interneurons. When you connect your battery pack, which will represent from now on with this power button icon, you'll notice the LED lights up. This is telling you that your interneuron has power, but something more important too. The color of the LED is telling you how excited your neuron is. The green light is telling you that your neuron is at rest. That makes sense, because nothing is stimulating it. Just like the neurons in your brain, NeuroBytes neuron simulators need input to do something. First, we'll experiment with your red excitatory neurotransmitter cables. There are touch receptors in your skin that work sort of like little switches, and these receptors send action potentials along sensory neurons to your brain to let you know that you've been touched on some part of your body. We'll use one of the touch sensors from your kit to simulate a touch and activate your NeuroBytes. Connect one end of a red cable to the switch, and the other end to one of the longest dendrites on the interneuron, number 2 or number 3. What happens when you give your switch one click? What happens when you give it 2 or more quick clicks? Now, disconnect your cable from your neuron by pinching the tab and pulling the cable out. Connect it to one of the short dendrites on your interneuron, number 1 or number 4. Now what happens when you give your switch one click? There are a couple things you hopefully learned here. First, as your interneuron got more excited, the LED changes color. The color is indicating the virtual membrane potential or voltage of your neuron simulator. Real neurons are able to use electricity to send signals because there is a difference in voltage across their membrane at rest, and that voltage difference changes dramatically during an action potential. When at rest, called resting membrane potential, your interneuron is green. As it gets more excited, like when it received one input on a long dendrite, the LED turned from green to red. If it gets excited enough and the voltage increases past a threshold level, like when you gave it 2 quick inputs on the long dendrite, or 1 on a short dendrite, it will fire an action potential which causes the LED to flash bright white. An action potential is the boost given by the neuron for the electrical signal to make it from the axon hillock to the axon terminal. After the white flash, the LED turns blue. This is called the hyperpolarization phase of the neuron. The membrane potential then returns to rest. This action potential firing starts at the axon hillock and then spreads in one direction down the axon towards the axon terminal, where the neurotransmitters are released in response to this voltage spike. Secondly, you may have realized that the longer the dendrite in the postsynaptic neuron, the more clicks, or the more energy, is needed to fire an action potential in that neuron. Dendrites are electrically leaky, kind of like a garden hose with holes in it. Dendrites in your brain really act like this, minus the water of course, and this leakiness is important for learning and memory, which you'll experiment with coming up soon, as well as other sensory neurons that detect light and motor neurons that control motion.